Welcome to the Deep Dive, where we take the most crucial research on human behavior and turn it into actionable insight.
Today, we are plunging deep into the mechanics of self-deception. We're exploring that universal human urge to justify our bad decisions, our wrong beliefs, and, our hurtful actions.
It's all captured in that one perfect bureaucratic phrase you hear after every scandal. Mistakes were made.
Exactly, that passive voice. It's like the sound of collective accountability just evaporating into thin air.
It's designed to let everyone off the hook, isn't it? I mean, you see it all through history. You had Henry Kissinger in the 70s trying to sidestep war crime charges.
Oh, what did he say? Something like,
Mistakes were quite possibly made by the administrations in which I served. Quite possibly.
wow. And it doesn't stop there. Cardinal Edward Egan used almost the same words when he was talking about the church's failure to address child abuse.
Right. If in hindsight we also discovered that mistakes may have been made, I am deeply sorry. The word if is doing a lot of work there.
It really is. And it's not just politics or religion. Even McDonald's did it. When they had to admit their natural flavoring for their vegetarian fries actually had beef in it.
So when a public figure uses that phrase, it's pretty much the strongest signal you can get that a huge fundamental error has happened, but nobody's going to own up to it.
And that leads us right to the central puzzle we're tackling today. And we're drawing heavily here from the foundational work of Tavris and Elliot Aronson.
The question being,
How do people, so-called knaves, fools, villains, and hypocrites, how do they actually live with themselves? How does anyone rationalize choices that cause massive harm or, just lead to their own personal ruin?
so our mission in this deep dive is to really get under the hood and understand the psychological engine that drives all that justification.
But before we get to the engine, there's an initial claim here that is genuinely shocking. And it's a bit counterintuitive.
I think so. It's this. When people are directly confronted with proof-cold, hard evidence that they are wrong, they almost never change course.
In fact, it's often the opposite. Confronting them usually makes them dig in their heels and justify that wrong course of action even more tenaciously.
It's just an insidious feature of how our minds work. We saw this play out on a huge geopolitical scale with George W. Bush and the Iraq War.
Right. The initial premise was that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction.
The WMDs, links to al-Qaeda, that the war would be quick, that the cost would be manageable, and one by one, every single one of those premises was proven to be false.
So what happened when the core reasons vanished?
Did he issue a retraction? Admit a catastrophic error in judgment? No. He just found new justifications. The goalposts just kept moving.
So the war wasn't about WMDs anymore. It became about...
Getting rid of a terrible dictator. Or promoting democracy in the Middle East. Or maybe the most powerful one, honoring the sacrifice of the troops who had already died there. The conviction that the decision was right never wavered, even when the reasons for it completely disappeared.
And this brings us to a really crucial psychological distinction. It's the difference between lying and self-justification.
They sound similar, but they're worlds apart.
Lying is a conscious act. You know the truth, but you intentionally deceive other people. Think of Richard Nixon saying, "I am not a crook." He knew he was.
But self-justification is different. That's lying to yourself. You're not trying to fool the outside world.
You're successfully fooling your internal world. You convince yourself, and I mean sincerely convince yourself, that what you did was the best thing I could have done. Or maybe even that it was the right thing for some greater good.
And that makes it so much more dangerous than a simple lie, doesn't it?
Profoundly more dangerous. A liar, they still carry the knowledge of the truth. You can extract it, you can expose it, but a person who is deep in self-justification, they have genuinely rewritten their own history. They're basically impervious to evidence, to regret, to any kind of correction.
Exactly. And this isn't just a mechanism for presidents or, cult leaders. It affects all of us every day in our private lives.
Oh, absolutely. Think about the sunk cost fallacy. You're in an unhappy relationship or a dead-end job. You've already put in 5, maybe 10 years.
That time is gone. You can't get it back. But admitting that feels like admitting you wasted a huge chunk of your life.
And that creates a conflict, a dissonance. I am a smart person versus I just wasted years of my life on a bad decision. So what do?
You resolve it. You invent new reasons why the job is actually secure or why your partner is dependable. Even if you're completely miserable, you justify staying.
Or what about that beautiful, expensive car that turns out to be a total lemon?
Oh, I know this one. You put thousands into repairs, way more than it's worth.
But you can't admit the initial purchase was a foolish mistake, so you keep pouring money into it.
And the news story you tell yourself is, well, now that I've replaced all the parts, it's practically a new car. The initial foolish action requires ongoing justification, which just leads to more foolish action.
And this is the very engine of personal hypocrisy. Aldous Huxley pointed out that a truly conscious hypocrite is actually pretty rare.
Most of us, when we do something that violates our own values, we blur the lines. We fudge the discrepancy between what we did and what we believe.
Think about the televangelist Ted Haggard. He was railing against homosexuality from the pulpit while he was secretly in a sexual relationship with a male prostitute.
Or Newt Gingrich condemning Bill Clinton's infidelity while having his own affair.
According to this theory, they weren't just consciously deceiving people for show, they had successfully rationalized their behavior to fit their core belief that they were fundamentally good and moral people.
It's so relatable, even on a tiny scale. Like you finesse some expenses on your income taxes, you take a few deductions you're not totally sure about.
And how do you justify it?
You tell yourself, well, the government just wastes money anyway, or I forgot to deduct other things that were legitimate, so it all evens out in the end.
Or surfing the web at work. You're not stealing company time.
Of course not. It's a necessary mental health break. Or, it's a silent protest against your terrible boss.
And the key thing here, the psychological insight, is that the truth of the justification doesn't matter one bit.
Whether the government wastes money is irrelevant.
Totally irrelevant. You cross the moral line first, and then you invent the justification second. And you do it so you can look in the mirror and continue to see yourself as an honest, hardworking person.
That immediate, automatic, internal storytelling process, that is cognitive dissonance in action.
Okay.
Okay, so let's move from the result, this constant need to justify, to the psychological engine that's driving the whole thing. And this is the cornerstone concept for this entire deep dive, cognitive dissonance.
Right. Leon Festinger developed this theory back in the 1950s, and he defined cognitive dissonance as an intensely unpleasant feeling. It's not just a minor discomfort, it's a fundamental state of psychological tension.
And it happens when two of your cognition, so your ideas, your beliefs, your knowledge of what you just did, are inconsistent with each other.
Exactly. The classic example is cognition 1, I am a smart, competent person. Cognition 2, I just invested my life savings in a truly idiotic scheme.
And that tension is it's intolerable. It's a direct threat to your identity, to your self-concept.
So your mind immediately mobilizes to resolve that conflict. And it almost always resolves it by changing the cognition that's easiest to change.
And the easiest one is almost never, I am a fool.
Almost never. It's much, much easier to adjust your perception of the action. So it wasn't a foolish scheme. It was a brilliant, calculated risk that just didn't pay off this time.
The quintessential case study for this has to be Festinger's own work when he infiltrated that doomsday cult in the 50s.
Oh, the one led by Marian Keech, yes. She believed she was getting messages from aliens, and she predicted the world would end in a great flood on December 21st.
And her followers were not casual believers. They were all in.
Totally committed. They'd sold their houses, given away their life savings, quit their jobs. All of it. They were just sitting in a room waiting for a spaceship to come pick them up at midnight.
Just imagine the level of commitment. They had literally burned their old lives to the ground for this belief. The dissonance when midnight came and went. It must have been off the charts.
Excruciating. I mean, think of the two conflicting cognitions. I have sacrificed everything I own for this group versus the prophecy failed, the leader is a fraud, and I am a complete idiot.
The psychological investment was just too high to admit they were wrong.
It was. So the resolution had to protect their self-concept. And then, at 4:45 in the morning, Marian Keech announced she'd received a new vision.
Which was?
That their little group, with their impressive faith, had generated so much spiritual light that they had actually saved the entire world from the flood.
And their reaction wasn't shame or despair.
It was pure exhilaration. The dissonance just vanished. Instantly. Their action sacrificing everything was no longer foolish, it was heroic, world-saving.
And critically, instead of just quietly slinking away in embarrassment, they did the opposite.
They became hyper-committed. They immediately called the newspapers. They ran out into the street to proselytize to strangers. They had to. They needed to recruit more people to validate their new belief, to reduce that last bit of lingering dissonance. They turned a total failure into a glorious success, all to protect that core belief in their own intelligence.
That's why this theory is so potent. It predicts behaviors that just fly in the face of simple logic or, reward and punishment.
Like the power of effort justification.
Right. We don't just value things based on their objective merit. We value them based on how much we suffered to get them.
That's the severe initiation experiment. It's a classic. If people have to go through pain or discomfort or serious embarrassment to achieve something, they will value it more than if it came easily.
The internal logic is pretty straightforward, isn't it?
It's simple dissonance reduction. I am a smart person. I just went through a painful and humiliating experience voluntarily. Therefore,
The thing I got for doing it must be incredibly valuable.
exactly. And in that experiment, students who suffered through these really embarrassing initiations to join a group, they later rated a completely boring discussion and the unappealing group members as fascinating and brilliant.
While the control group, who had a really mild, easy initiation,
They saw it for what it was. They correctly rated the group as tedious and the discussion as dull. The first group had to distort their perception to justify their effort.
it's this idea of believing is seeing.
That's it. We don't objectively see the world and then decide what to believe. We first decide what we need to believe, usually, that we're smart and competent, and then we distort what we see to make sure the world aligns with that belief.
So to put it in a ridiculous example,
Yeah.
if I accidentally trip and fall and break my leg on the way to a meeting, I'm not going to think the meeting was great. I'll just be angry.
Right.
But if I had to voluntarily agree to have my leg broken in order to gain entry to that meeting,
And then you would convince yourself it was the most intellectually stimulating, life-changing meeting of the year.
it had to be to justify the pain.
Precisely. The voluntary commitment is the key. And this mechanism is a huge reason why we become so impervious to new facts. It leads directly to confirmation bias.
And this is absolutely critical in politics. After the Iraq War started and it became clear there were no WMDs, the commitment among supporters was already so high.
Admitting the entire basis for the war was false would have created just a profound, gut-wrenching dissonance.
So instead of changing their belief in the war, they resolved the dissonance by just rejecting the evidence.
You saw it in the polls. A huge number of war supporters, over half in some polls, actually believed the weapons had been found. They just successfully screened out all the dissonant information coming from the news.
And they weren't lying to the pollsters. They genuinely believed it. They had to. It was the only way to protect their self-image as supporters of a necessary and righteous cause.
We see this played out perfectly in the capital punishment study. It's a fantastic illustration of how reading information that opposes your view can actually make you strengthen your original conviction.
Which seems completely illogical.
It is irrational, but it's psychologically consistent. Researchers took people who were either strongly for or strongly against the death penalty.
And they gave them 2 articles to read. Both were well-documented, scholarly papers. One supported the idea that capital punishment is a deterrent. The other argued it wasn't.
Logically, you'd think the participants would see the complexity of the issue and maybe move toward a more nuanced middle ground.
But they moved farther apart.
Much farther apart. They cherry-picked. They praised the methodology and rigor of the article that confirmed their own bias. They called it objective, competent work.
And the other article.
They tore it to shreds. They attacked its sources, its authors, its whole premise. The data itself became a threat to their identity, so the fastest way to resolve that threat was to just annihilate the credibility of the source.
Yeah.
They didn't become better informed. They became more polarized.
It really does sound like cognitive dissonance acts like a kind of psychological thermostat.
That's a perfect metaphor. It's designed specifically to keep our self-esteem high and stable.
And the irony is, this isn't just for, average people. It applies just as much to highly confident professionals.
Even more so in some cases. The political scientist Philip Tetlock studied forecasting experts for years. He found that the more self-confident and famous they were, the less likely they were to admit errors when their predictions failed.
They're just masters of the if-only justification.
Oh, absolutely.
Oh.
My forecast would have been correct if only the Federal Reserve hadn't acted on Tuesday, or if only that completely unpredictable geopolitical event hadn't happened.
They never, ever say, I got the model wrong.
Never. They resolved the dissonance, I am a famous, brilliant expert, versus my forecast was horribly wrong, by just blaming external, unpredictable forces.
Okay, but what about people with low self-esteem? Do they still experience dissonance in the same way? If I already think of myself as incompetent, I'm not going to be surprised when I fail. It's more like, yep, I screwed up again. That's just like me.
That is a key insight. Dissonance is about protecting any deeply held self-concept, high or low. For someone with low self-esteem, failure is actually consonant. It confirms their worldview.
So for them, the dissonance actually comes from success.
Exactly. If a woman who believes she is fundamentally unlovable is suddenly pursued by a wonderful, caring partner or wins a Pulitzer Prize, that creates intense dissonance. The two cognitions, I am unlovable and worthless, versus this amazing thing just happened to me, are in direct conflict.
So she might sabotage the relationship or dismiss the prize as a total fluke, an anomaly.
She will find a way to return her emotional state to consonance with her core self-concept, even if that means rejecting genuine success and happiness. The self-justification mechanism works to keep our view of ourselves, whatever that view is, consistent and stable.
Okay, that makes the mechanism crystal clear. But let's talk about the scale of the impact, because dissonance gets dramatically intensified when the decisions we make are big or public or irreversible.
Irrevocability is the pressure cooker. The moment we make a huge commitment, that justification process kicks into overdrive to maintain the illusion that we acted rationally.
We talked about Ingrid Bergman in Casablanca. The social psychologist Dan Gilbert posed the question, would she have regretted staying with Victor Laszlo or leaving with Humphrey Bogart?
And dissonance theory has a clear prediction. In the long run, she would have been happy with either choice.
Because she would have immediately started justifying it.
She would have built up all the reasons why the path she chose was the best possible outcome and downplayed the attractions of the path she rejected. We are absolutely wired to bolster our major decisions after we've made them.
It reminds me of that story of Nick, the guy who impulsively bought an expensive Mercedes right when his kids were heading off to college.
Creating immediate financial stress for the family. That decision wasn't just a choice. It had to become a whole lifestyle that demanded justification.
So he immediately became an evangelist for the brand. He started proselytizing to all his friends who drove cheaper cars.
Right. The car wasn't a massive, questionable expense anymore. It was suddenly a statement about quality, a necessary safety feature, and a reward I've earned. He needed other people to validate his choice, to reduce his own internal conflict.
Or your own story about buying the canoe, just to justify buying a house in the suburbs far from campus.
Yes. In the dead of a Minneapolis winter, the house was a huge commitment, and the long commute was creating a lot of dissonance. But by bringing that canoe into the garage, even though the lake was frozen solid for months,
You could tell yourself a different story.
I could look at it and think, this commute is worth it. I now have access to nature. I have this boating life right outside my door. That unused canoe was a brilliant piece of psychological armor that got me through the whole winter.
So these big, irreversible commitments demand immediate, massive self-justification. But what about the small stuff? The little moral compromises? How do tiny decisions lead to such radical, unshakable certainty?
That's where the moral pyramid metaphor is so powerful. It's probably the most important visual tool for understanding that slippery slope of morality.
So set it up for us.
Imagine two young people. They're both facing an opportunity to cheat on a big exam. In terms of their principles, they're basically identical. They're maybe a millimeter apart at the very peak of this pyramid.
And they both start with a sort of middling, ambivalent view on cheating. It's not great, but maybe in some circumstances.
Exactly. But then the choice has to be made. One of them cheats, the other one resists. The action is taken. And the process of self-justification begins instantly, pushing them away from that peak.
So the one who resists the temptation, he now feels dissonance if he doesn't judge the cheater harshly.
He has to. He justifies his own difficult choice by cementing his belief that cheating is totally immoral and that the person who did it is contemptible.
Meanwhile, the cheater has to justify his action.
He has to, so he rationalizes. The exam was unfair, or everyone does it, or the professor is a jerk. And he now views the person who resisted as hopelessly puritanical, a goody two-shoes.
So that initial ambivalence just vanishes and morphs into absolute certainty, and they slide down to opposite corners of the pyramid's base, now miles apart in their moral self-concepts, all from one small action.
And this is exactly how seemingly decent people can make these radical moral shifts. They don't just take one giant leap off a moral cliff.
No, it's a chain reaction, a series of small, justified steps down that slippery slope.
The classic historical example of this kind of entrapment is Jeb Stuart Magruder, the young, ambitious assistant to Richard Nixon who got tangled up in the Watergate conspiracy.
He didn't start out as some kind of criminal mastermind?
Not at all. He was hired for his ambition and his smarts, But his first step down the pyramid was tiny. It was just justifying his boss, H.R. Haldeman, going on a brutal tirade over something completely trivial like a missing golf cart.
So Magruder, who desperately wanted to stay in that powerful circle, had to make sense of this awful behavior.
So he reasoned that Haldeman's bullying was just a necessary consequence of the sheer perfection that was demanded in the White House. He compromised his own ethical sense just a little bit, all to maintain his proximity to power.
And that one small compromise of principle just paved the way for the much bigger illegal actions that followed.
Right. When it came to G. Gordon Liddy's plan for the Watergate break-in, the whole team went along with it. But the critical insight is that Liddy didn't present this simple break-in plan first.
No, he came in with something completely insane.
A $1 million scheme involving high-class prostitutes, kidnapping squads, sabotaging the air conditioning at the Democratic Convention.
Yeah.
Just bonkers stuff.
So by comparison, the wiretapping plans
It seemed rational. They felt like they were the sensible ones, toning down this madman. They justified approving the illegal wiretapping because they felt they needed to leave Liddy a little something so he wouldn't feel sidelined. They were preserving team cohesion.
They were entrapped. Each small step created the moral certainty needed for the next, more egregious step.
And this gives us a completely new way to look at the classic Milgram experiment on obedience.
It's not just about obeying authority. It's a perfect study of the moral pyramid.
Absolutely. Think about it. If Milgram had just asked participants to walk in and deliver a 450-volt shock right away, almost everyone would have refused.
Of course.
But the experiment starts gradually. 10 volts, harmless. Then 20 volts. It's just a small harmless jolt. Then 30.
And at each step, the participant have to justify their action.
Well, 30 isn't much more than 20. If 20 was okay, 30 must be okay too. And once you've justified 30 volts, you've already crossed a small moral line, which makes justifying 40 volts just a tiny bit easier.
The dissonance is being reduced at every single stage, completely masking the final horrifying endpoint of that long, slow process.
Ordinary, decent people committed immoral acts through this chain reaction of behavior, followed by self-justification. As Magruder himself said at his sentencing, "Somewhere between my ambition and my ideals, I lost my ethical compass."
That compass wasn't just stolen. It was eroded, one tiny justification at a time. Now, the consequences of this mechanism, they just grow exponentially when they move from our personal lives into our professional and institutional lives. And the first layer of defense here is something called naive realism.
Right. Naive realism is the conviction that I perceive events and objects clearly as they really are.
Which means, therefore, that anyone who disagrees with me must be biased or unreasonable or just plain stupid.
It's a universal human tendency, but it's especially toxic in professional settings. It creates these massive institutional blind spots and denial. It makes us utterly incapable of seeing our own conflicts of interest.
A truly chilling example is the story of Ignaz Semmelweis, the doctor in Vienna, back in 1847.
Oh, the hand-washing story. It's incredible. Childbed fever was killing thousands of women in maternity wards. And Semmelweis figured out that the doctors themselves were carrying the infection from the autopsy rooms into the delivery wards.
And he proved that a simple intervention, just washing their hands in an antiseptic solution, caused mortality rates to plummet.
The data was irrefutable. It was a life-saving discovery. And yet his medical colleagues, they violently rejected his evidence. They scorned him until he died, alone in an asylum.
Why? Why would they reject something so obvious?
Because accepting Semmelweis's findings meant accepting an absolutely intolerable cognition. I, a wise and respected healer, have been personally responsible for the unnecessary deaths of countless women and children.
It was a direct existential threat to their professional ego. So they protected their self-image as competent physicians over accepting undeniable scientific proof.
And that mechanism, that instinct to protect professional integrity over admitting culpability, is still incredibly strong today.
We see it dramatically in scientific research, especially when money gets involved.
Right.
It leads to this huge problem of funding bias.
Look at studies of new drugs or chemicals. When you compare the results of studies funded by the industry that makes the product to studies funded independently, the results are just shockingly different.
I remember the numbers. It's something like only 14% of industry-funded studies find harmful effect.
Right, compared to 60% of independently funded studies. Now, if we assume the scientists aren't all just deliberately cheating, what's the psychological mechanism?
It's that subtle, powerful pressure of dissonance and self-justification.
Scientific data is rarely black and white. There's almost always ambiguity. So if you're a scientist and your career and funding depend on the company that's paying for your research, and you find some ambiguous data, say a slightly increased risk of stroke, as was the case with Vioxx,
Hmm.
you have two options.
You can say, stop everything. This is potentially dangerous, which threatens your funding, your career, your relationship with the company.
Or you can unconsciously resolve that ambiguity in the company's favor. You can tell yourself, well, the data is unclear, or those patients were already quite sick, or we should really focus on the overwhelming evidence of efficacy.
It's like a plant turning toward the sun.
That's a perfect way to put it. These well-intentioned researchers just unconsciously tilt their interpretations toward the interests of their sponsors. It allows them to preserve their self-image as both competent scientists and successful professionals.
And this bias gets reinforced by that seemingly innocuous phenomenon of reciprocity, the famous gift that keeps on giving.
Yes. Doctors, for example, want to believe that their high professional integrity can't possibly be influenced by a free pizza lunch or a box of donuts from a pharmaceutical rep.
But the marketers and the social psychologists know better.
They know that small gifts, often things under $100, are psychologically way more influential than a massive bribe. A big bribe sets off all your moral alarm bells.
But a small gift, it just creates this implicit, unconscious obligation to reciprocate.
It's the Hare Krishna, pinning a flower on your jacket before asking for a donation. It's the Fuller brush salesman giving you a free scrubber. It's an ethical Trojan horse.
The position resolves the dissonance. I'm an objective scientist versus I just accepted a gift from this company by saying,
It's just a pizza. My judgment isn't compromised. But the data is clear. The amount of contact doctors have with industry reps is directly correlated with how often they prescribe that company's expensive new drugs, even when they know a cheaper generic alternative is available.
and we see this same slippery slope in politics. I remember Dorothy Samuels of the New York Times asking why Congressman Tom DeLay would risk his entire career for something that seemed so minor, like a golf trip to St. Andrews.
Because no one ever risks their whole career for the first offer. The big trip to St. Andrews was only possible because it was preceded by hundreds of smaller inducements that he had already accepted and successfully justified.
Lunches, local trips, concert ticket.
All of which slid him slowly down that pyramid until the much larger trip just seemed like a natural continuation of an already justified behavior. The story he told himself wasn't, I'm accepting a bribe.
No, it was, I'm just gathering important information from my constituents.
And sometimes the discrimination itself actually creates the justification, like in Al Campanis' story from baseball.
Right. Campoise was the general manager for the Dodgers. He wasn't a hateful, traditional bigot. He had championed Jackie Robinson.
But when he was asked on television why there were no black managers in baseball, he said it was because black players lacked the necessities to be managers.
So the dissonance for him was immense. It was, I'm a good, fair person who supports black players versus I have never once hired a black manager.
Exactly. So instead of admitting he might be biased or that the system was unfair, he invented a stereotype to justify his inaction.
The discrimination came first.
The discrimination, the failure to hire, evoked the self-justifying stereotype that they simply weren't qualified. It allowed him to maintain his self-image as a good, unprejudiced person while continuing to perpetuate a discriminatory system. The path between attitude and action runs both ways.
So if self-justification can distort our perception of our present actions, it becomes absolutely terrifying when it gets its hands on our past. Our memory isn't some reliable recording device, is it?
Not even close. It's an active storyteller. The writer William Maxwell called it an unreliable, self-serving historian that is constantly pruning and shaping past events to make us look good, to enhance our ego.
This is why, when you survey married couples about housework, they both consistently overestimate their own contributions.
Right. If you add up their individual estimates, the total almost always comes out to way more than 100%. We just remember all of our own heroic efforts and conveniently, unconsciously forget all the times we slacked off.
John Dean talked about this with Watergate. He said if you repeat a lie often enough, like the claim that the wiretaps were for national security instead of political gain, you eventually come to believe your own story.
The lie becomes a sincere memory. A fascinating personal example of this kind of memory inversion involved the journalist Tom Brokaw and the writer Gore Vidal.
What happened there?
Well, years after he'd interviewed Vidal, Brokaw was recalling the exchange, and he genuinely believed that he had wanted to talk about serious politics, but that Vidal kept insisting on talking about his bisexuality.
And the reality.
The reality, which was captured on tape, was the absolute reverse. Brokaw unconsciously inverted the entire memory to preserve his own self-image as a serious intellectual news anchor.
Okay, that's harmless enough between two famous people, but these kinds of memory errors, when they get tangled up with trauma or personal identity, they can lead to these devastating false memory epidemics.
And to the phenomenon of confabulation, which is where you construct a vivid, detailed memory of something that never actually happened.
The psychology behind this is called imagination inflation.
Exactly. Researchers found that if they just asked participants to repeatedly imagine an unlikely event from their childhood, like a nurse taking a skin sample from their finger, it dramatically increases the participants' confidence that it really happened. They'll even start adding their own sensory detail.
The act of imagining it makes the memory feel real.
And the ultimate tragic test of this phenomenon is the quest for identity, which we saw in the shocking case of Benjamin Wilkomirski.
This was the man who wrote the famous Holocaust memoir.
Right. Except he wasn't Benjamin Wilkomirski. He was Bruno Grosjean, a second-rate Swiss clarinetist. His early life had been difficult, but not extraordinary. So to resolve his own psychological distress and, this hunger for a more powerful purpose, he immersed himself in Holocaust accounts.
And he created a new identity. The desire for a heroic identity literally fueled the creation of the memory.
It did. And when actual historical facts conflicted with his new narrative, for instance, when historians at the Majdanek concentration camp just laughed at his claim about a children's quarantine, he just rejected them.
He resolved the dissonance.
He said, "I could depend more on my memory than on what is said by the so-called historians." He chose his self-justifying narrative over objective truth because it had brought him fame and adoration and a sense of purpose.
And you see this same mechanism driving many people who sincerely believe they've been abducted by aliens.
Many of those experiences start with sleep paralysis, which is a very common, very mundane physiological event where your brain wakes up before your body does. It can often lead to waking hallucinations.
But for someone who is already experiencing deep anxiety or depression, that mundane scientific explanation is dissonant with the intense, terrifying emotional reality of the experience.
The dramatic explanation, alien abduction, actually captures that emotional intensity much better. It resolves the dissonance. I'm not just a person with psychological problems. I am a chosen special victim of extraterrestrials. It makes them feel special, not broken.
They reject the mundane because the dramatic explanation feels real. And this leads us straight to the terrifying consequences of the recovered memory movement in therapy.
As seen in the Holly Ramona case, this was a young woman who went into therapy for bulimia and depression. Her therapist started with a huge logical fallacy.
The idea that if some women with bulimia have been sexually abused, then all women with bulimia must have been.
And this therapist, completely convinced of this belief, just actively pushed Holly to find memories of abuse. She used hypnosis, even so-called truth serum.
And Holly eventually remembered being repeatedly raped by her father.
The therapist's core belief that her theory was correct and that she was a competent healer created this completely closed loop of confirmation bias.
Right. If the client didn't get better, it's because they were resistant.
And if they denied ever being abused, that was just proof of repression.
The therapist's professional integrity was never threatened because her theory was infallible. All evidence, even contradictory evidence, just confirmed how difficult it was to unearth the deep trauma. The therapist's self-justification completely ruined Holly Ramona's life, all based on implanted false memories fueled by a logical fallacy, not by science. Now, when we take that closed loop of self-justification and we move it into the justice system, the stakes become life and death. The dissonance for officials is just immense.
Oh, it's overwhelming. The two cognitions are, I am a competent, honorable officer of the court, versus I may have sent an innocent man to prison for life.
That's psychologically intolerable.
So their immediate reaction, when faced with something like a DNA exoneration, is profound dissonance reduction. They refuse to accept the new evidence. They'll claim the exoneration is a wrongful pardon, or they'll say that wrongful convictions are extremely rare and it's a reasonable price to pay for an otherwise great justice system. They build these walls of defense to let them sleep at night.
But the confirmation bias often starts right at the very beginning of an investigation. Detectives and prosecutors make an initial decision about who they think is guilty.
And then all subsequent evidence is just filtered through that lens of certainty.
The Stephanie Crowe murder case is one of the most tragic examples of this kind of cognitive lock. A 14-year-old girl was murdered.
And the detectives immediately focused on her older brother, Michael. They based this on the statistical profile that most murders are inside jobs. And that initial certainty created this powerful cognitive roadblock.
They completely ignored key evidence that implicated a known neighborhood vagrant, a man named Richard Tweet.
Even after they found the victim's blood on Tweet's clothing and got a plausible confession from him, they resisted.
Why? Why would they resist such clear evidence?
Because accepting it meant admitting they had spent months chasing the wrong person, coercing a false confession out of an innocent boy, and letting the real murderer walk free. That level of self-incrimination was just too much to bear. It took another detective, someone not on the original team, to come in without that initial bias and actually follow the evidence.
One of the hardest things for the public to wrap their heads around in these cases is the false confession.
We assume it's ludicrous. Why would an innocent person ever confess to a crime they didn't commit? But it's often a direct consequence of dissonance that is engineered by the interrogators.
Interrogators themselves often operate with this profound certainty of guilt, especially if they're using a manual like the Reed technique.
The manual itself states that an interrogation should only proceed when the investigator is reasonably certain of the suspect's guilt. So that certainty means the interrogator interprets everything: denial, nervousness, silence as further proof of lying.
And the technique is designed to create the highest possible level of dissonance in the suspect.
Precisely. The interrogator is legally allowed to introduce fictitious evidence. They'll say, "We found your DNA at the scene," or "Your accomplice already confessed and told us you did it."
And this manufactured evidence directly conflicts with the suspect's own internal knowledge of their innocence.
"I know I am innocent" versus "These authority figures are telling me there is irrefutable evidence that I am guilty." And the suspect, who is often exhausted, scared, and trusting of authority, doesn't get angry. They just feel confused and hopeless.
And their resolution strategy is just astonishing.
They resolve the conflict by concluding they must have committed the crime and then blocked it out, repressed the memory. They confess just to relieve the intense psychological pressure, hoping it will lead to leniency.
This closed loop of certainty is why so many prosecutors will refuse to correct errors, even when they are faced with irrefutable scientific proof, like DNA.
You see it in that famous quote from the Philadelphia district attorney who rejected a DNA exoneration. He said, "I have no scientific basis. I know because I trust my detective and my tape-recorded confession."
That dismissal is pure self-justification.
The bet has been placed, the conviction has been secured, and the officials are now completely committed to interpreting all new data as confirmation of their brilliant original decision.
So the remedy here is humility, which is maybe the hardest thing to teach someone in a high-stakes, competitive profession.
It absolutely is. Training in law enforcement and in law schools has to include robust information on these cognitive biases, on the fallibility of human judgment, and on the reality of why innocent people confess. Overconfidence is the enemy of justice. You have to learn to question the certainty of your own gut feelings and build in institutional checks against that confirmation bias.
The same psychological dynamic that locks a prosecutor into a wrongful conviction is the exact same one that can destroy a marriage. Self-justification just completely replaces empathy.
And it turns minor disagreements into these huge existential crises. It just accelerates conflict in a relationship.
Benjamin Franklin had that classic advice for managing domestic dissonance.
Keep your eyes wide open before marriage and half shut afterward. A little bit of moderate positive distortion, seeing your partner as slightly better than they actually are, is actually healthy for a relationship. But when serious conflicts come up, that justification spiral becomes incredibly destructive.
Let's look at the example of Deborah and Frank. They agree on the basic facts of their argument. The fight after dinner, him putting the pillow over his head. But their interpretations of those facts are from two different planets.
And this is the central dissonance trap in all relationships. Frank judges himself by his virtuous intentions. His internal monologue is, "I'm basically a tolerant person. I don't cheat or lie. I love my wife."
But he judges Deborah purely by her undesirable actions. She is irrational. She is acting like a baby.
And Deborah does the exact reverse. She judges herself by her good intentions. She just wants closeness. She wants to connect. But she judges Frank by his undesirable actions. He's passive, he's withdrawn, he's shutting down the conversation.
So each of them uses their own good intentions as an excuse for their own bad behavior and uses the other's actions as proof of their flawed character.
They are both operating under that naive realism we talked about. They're each completely convinced that they see the absolute truth of the situation and that the other person is just choosing to be unreasonable.
And the spiral escalates really quickly when the argument shifts from being about actions
Like, you forgot to take out the trash.
to being about unfixable global personality flaws. You're always irresponsible, just like your father.
The moment you tell your partner that's just the way you are genetically irredeemably flawed, you trigger shame and helplessness.
And that is the spiral of contempt, which the researcher John Gottman identified as the single strongest predictor of divorce.
Contempt comes up because the justifying partner now believes the other person has a character flaw that can't be fixed. So they feel justified in being superior, in dismissing their partner, in just giving up. They rationalize their lack of empathy by thinking, well, it's impossible to be rational with a crazy person.
And this pattern, it extends directly from the personal to the geopolitical through moral disengagement and the spiral of aggression.
The greater the harm we inflict on other people, the greater our need to justify it, just to maintain our self-image as decent human beings. The formula is simple.
Doing harm begets the need to justify it,
They deserved what they got.
which then begets further aggression.
Whether that's bullying on the playground, domestic abuse, or atrocities in wartime.
This was just chillingly evident in the Abu Ghraib prison scandal.
The soldiers who committed those acts of torture and humiliation had to reconcile that action with their own self-image as honorable American soldiers. And they did it by denigrating and dehumanizing their victims.
Calling them stupid jerks or
Yeah.
vermin or animals.
And dissonance theory predicts that it's actually perpetrators with high self-esteem who are the most likely to denigrate helpless victims.
Why is that?
Because the dissonance is higher for them. Terrific guys like me don't hurt innocent people. Therefore, the people I'm hurting cannot be innocent. They must deserve this pain.
And on an institutional level, this just leads to that endless, cyclical argument over who started it.
Whether you're looking at the Iran hostage crisis or the Israeli-Arab conflict, or even older conflicts like the Crusades or the American Civil War, the answer to who started it depends entirely on how many centuries back you decide to go to justify your own side's actions.
Both sides have these highly selective, self-serving historical memories. One side focuses on its victimhood, the other on its justified retaliation.
Exactly. The collective memory of a nation is calibrated to maximize its own current justification. And that's why resolution is so difficult. It requires perpetrators to sincerely atone, to stop justifying the past, and it requires victims to choose to relinquish revenge, like what we saw in South Africa with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. The healing process requires both sides to consciously fight that deep, primal instinct to protect their own moral narrative.
So we've seen the immense power of self-justification, this incredible architecture the mind builds just to protect the ego. But here's the central irony of it all.
That while the mind tries to protect itself with these delusions, the soul, for lack of a better word, seems to crave confession and accountability.
And admitting a mistake is the ultimate sign of strength, not of weakness.
It's profoundly liberating because it breaks that cognitive lock. We saw this with Oprah Winfrey after she had endorsed James Frey's fabricated memoir, A Million Little Pieces.
Her first instinct was pure dissonance reduction. She called into Larry King to try and justify her support for him.
But then she stopped herself. She caught it. And she then dedicated an entire episode of her own show to a public apology, correcting her own self-justification loop live on air.
She told her audience, "I made a mistake, and I left the impression that the truth does not matter, and I am deeply sorry."
And that act of humility was immediately praised. The public and the press celebrated her for her courage and integrity. She got criticized for the mistake, but she got celebrated for the admission.
We see the same thing in these high-stakes professional environments. And Wayne Hale Jr., the NASA manager, took full public responsibility for the Columbia shuttle disaster.
Right. In an email, he just stated it plainly. I failed to understand. I am guilty of allowing Columbia to crash. He used the active voice. He owned it.
And it didn't ruin his career. He was later promoted. It's similar to John F. Kennedy taking full responsibility for the disastrous Bay of Pigs invasion.
It led to a massive surge in his popularity. It satisfied the public's, this genuine hunger for honesty and integrity from our leaders. People fundamentally long to hear authority figures admit when they're wrong.
But culturally, we are so deeply mistake-phobic.
Mm-hmm.
Especially in America, we link making a mistake with being incompetent or stupid.
Mm.
And that just encourages everyone to hide their errors immediately.
The anecdote about the traffic school is perfect evidence of this. You have a room full of drivers who have all committed violations, and one by one, they all get up and offer these elaborate justifications for why it wasn't really their fault.
The tree was in the way, the stoplight was yellow, the officer was having a bad day.
Until one student stood up and just said, "I didn't stop at the stop sign. I was entirely wrong and I got caught."
And the whole room cheered.
We crave that honesty from others, but we struggle so immensely to deliver it ourselves. This is in sharp contrast to models of learning in many Asian countries, where the research by Carol Dweck has shown that students tend to view mistakes as a natural, essential part of the learning process, not as evidence that they lack some inherent ability.
So if we know we're wired this way, to hide our errors and justify everything, how do we break that wiring? How do we learn to live with dissonance in a healthy way?
We have to learn to adopt what's been called the third way. The goal is to separate the person from the action. When your friend makes a mistake, the friend remains your friend, and the mistake remains a mistake. You don't have to change your core belief about the person just to criticize their action.
The story of Betty and her divorce illustrates that so well. For years, she had blamed her daughter for being so devastated by the separation. She was justifying her own decision as being necessary and positive.
But eventually, she was able to stop blaming her daughter for her pain, and she finally admitted to herself, "I understood now how much it had hurt her." She didn't have to admit that getting divorced was the wrong decision. She just had to let go of the need to be 100% right about its consequences.
And that allowed her to finally connect with her daughter's pain and start healing the relationship.
Ultimately, the test of a person's character isn't whether they are error-free. It's about what we do after we make the error.
And that takes us right back to President Eisenhower and his D-Day failure note. Before the invasion, he prepared a message to release in case the operation failed.
And crucially, he revised the note. He changed the passive voice, "The troops have been withdrawn," to the active, accountable voice, "And I have withdrawn the troops."
An error doesn't become a mistake until you refuse to correct it.
Our knowledge of our own psychological blind spots should be the very thing that motivates us to override them.
So we've established that this process, self-justification, is universal, it's automatic, and it's designed by our minds to protect our self-image. Integrity, then, requires us to consciously overcome that wiring and choose honesty over comfort.
Which leaves us with a final thought to mull over. If we are so incredibly relieved and grateful when other people, our spouses, our colleagues, our public leaders, finally own up to their mistakes, why is it so incredibly difficult to offer that same admission ourselves, even when we know it would benefit our relationships, our careers, and our own conscience?
To visualize the core concepts covered here in a fast, accessible format, check the description for the mini explainer video that accompanies this deep dive.
We'll see you next time on The Deep Dive.